Hello, this is Pastor Larry Crispin of Bright Temple Church of God in Christ, and here I am in the sanctuary with my good friend, Pastor Jimmy West of Edgemont Baptist Church. We're here to have a very open and frank conversation about race and some of the things that are plaguing our times. We wanted to talk as friends, we're brothers, and we wanted to share from our heart some things that we believe that will be helpful and be a blessing to someone who needs to know these conversations, who needs to hear these conversations, and who wants to be encouraged by another perspective or another point of view. And we're just glad to have Pastor Jimmy West with us. He's also the president of the Ministerial Alliance here in Shelbyville. Pastor West, will you give tell a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brother Chrisman. It's just a joy to be able to sit down and have a conversation where we can talk about issues that we see constantly plaguing our society, but nobody's really talking. A lot of people are screaming,
Right.
but people aren't talking. And so we understand that everyone is always going to have a difference of opinion and a different way of looking at things. And there's no way we're ever going to agree on everything 100%. But if we can talk, there was a time when you could have a conversation with someone, and even if you didn't agree, you respected
Right.
one another's viewpoint. Well, we've kind of lost sight of that in our
Right.
culture today.
Right.
Everything is turned to cancel culture. If you
Yeah.
don't agree with me, then you're the
Right.
enemy. Well, you are not my enemy.
Right.
We should be fighting the right things, and instead we're fighting the wrong things. And so,
Right.
my hope and my prayer is that this conversation will help us to understand how we view things.
Right.
And my prayers, it'll be a help to others.
Don't try and transpose a problem to our community just because you've seen it somewhere else. And I think, and that goes back to the same thing like teaching your kid. You had a problem. Don't teach your kid to hate all police officers. You had a problem with one person who called you a name. Don't teach them that all white people are racist. And we have to do the same today. This is wrong. That guy was wrong. That incident is wrong. There are some things that need to be addressed as it relates to training and understanding that black people are not a superior threat just because they're black. But don't go out there and cuss out the police officer in your neighborhood
Right.
and immediately start, being rude or evil to him because that was not him.
Sure. And I appreciate you making the connection there. And it's not the bad of one person does not speak for an entire culture or group or entity or whatever the case may be. There's always bad. Evil isn't anything new.
Right.
There's always evil. You had talked about being called the N word. I've thought so many times there's nothing that you could ever call me that would really bother me.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and there's not one word. I mean, you could try to make up some type of slang
Right.
word to call me,
Right.
but really, in my heart of hearts, at the end of the day, it doesn't bother me.
Right.
But when you think about it in reverse, when you think of that word, it is such a derogatory, such a hateful word that brings up so much, and people, I feel like sometimes they lose sight of that. They don't
Right.
realize the connection when you
Right.
use terminology or poor vocabulary like that, what that really means and how that hurts an individual. Um,
And it goes back to there touching that touched on there is that, and I use my mother as a young person. We used to go to Opryland, and Opryland back then was a theme park in Nashville. Loved Opryland. Went to all the rides. I miss it some. Wish I could take my children there, but it shut down. My mom would not ride the ride. She was genuinely afraid of roller coasters, and I, as a child, I had no comprehension or understanding of that. I'm like, why are you afraid of a roller coaster? Of course, I'm 12, 13 years old. That that did not resonate with me at all. Like, it did not register. How can you be afraid of roller coasters? That is an irrational fear. It's not a big deal. And similarly, on the other side of what you're saying, because the N word, because that is so offensive, and there is no correlative, there is no contrapositive to
right,
that, where someone feels as offended to that, then because there's something on this side that offends, just like my mom being afraid of roller coasters, if you're on the other side, you're compassionate to it, but some people don't understand.
right,
Then they're like, you just too easily offended, or you're too easily. The word today is triggered. You're
right,
too triggered. You're just weak, and you just let everything offend you. But it's easy when there is nothing in society that offends you on the same level as that. if nothing in society can offend you on that level, then it's easy to say that other people are just too easily offended or
Sure.
triggered, because there's no response that makes you feel that same way. So that's something else. And like I said, you've shown, like you were saying, you're sensitive to that and understand and appreciate that. There are a lot of people who don't. So since they can't be offended on the other side, then they presume everybody else is just super sensitive, and like, just toughen up. Don't be so sensitive. Don't be so easily triggered. It's easy for you to say because there's nothing that offends you on that same level
Sure.
on the other side.
We had talked about, and I want you to answer. You'd given a great answer about ancestry
Right.
and looking back. There are those that say, when you look at the racism issue, they'll say, well, you know what? There's no slavery now.
Right.
Of course, we understand that. We know that there's no slavery now. I've never owned slaves.
Right.
My dad never owned slaves. Why are we still talking about this? Why
Right.
is it happened so long ago?
Right.
Why is this still an issue? I really like the answer that you gave.
Yeah. Well, see, when it comes to that, it's first of all, as I mentioned earlier, it's just a trigger, because if there weren't hundreds of years of slavery, would nigger be so offensive? Because it triggers it relates to that. Because if not, I don't think it doesn't have a basis in anything factual that would make it so offensive. But because it has roots in slavery and so many years of injustice, then that brings it along. And then it goes back to a mindset, and it is not just mentally, emotionally, but it's social and financial too.
Yeah.
So, for example, like I tell, and some people think, like I said, slavery. Oh, that was the end of racism in America. Okay, no, and they think it's a long time ago. But my father and my mother both went to segregated schools. Both of them went to segregated schools. My father in Shelbyville. So many can identify with that. I think he went to Bedford County Training School until eighth grade, but it was a segregated school until he was in eighth grade. Shelbyville Central High School did not integrate until his freshman year. So that was his freshman year, probably would have been, and somebody might get me on this, like 1965, because I think he graduated in 69. So around 65, 66. So his freshman year was his first year in an integrated school. So for the 9 years, kindergarten through eighth grade, segregated school, uh, inferior materials, inferior books. They got leftovers, weren't really considered. That's what he grew up. I was the first. My grandmother and nor grandfather made it past the eighth grade. My father was the first person to get a high school diploma and a college degree. First person to get a high school diploma. My father. We're not talking about my great great grandfather. We're talking about my father, my dad, first on his family to get a high school diploma. And when you look on the other side, so many white people, their great great grandfather, their great great grandfather, and their great great great
Right.
grandfather, they had high school diplomas and college degrees and were doctorates, and had all of that advanced education. Because there were opportunities, but we weren't allowed to go to school. We weren't allowed to read. I mean, slavery ended in 1865. I mean, 160 years ago, however we do that, we weren't even allowed to read. So they couldn't even read. We go back at, for example, slavery, how it impacts ancestry.com. I want to look up my ancestors. Well, 1900 census, that's about it. You get to the 1900 census, that's about it, because that's when they start counting us. That's when we started, I guess, actually mattering. Before then, we were property. And so we miss those connections too.
Yeah.
So many connections that my sons have because of me and my brother. My brother and I, we both have law degrees. But for example, that my sons, their principal at their school, they had a connection in knowing him because he knew my brother and had gone to school with my brother, because my brother had gotten his doctorate and gotten his bachelor's of science and all of that. But they had that connection just through us. But we don't have hundreds of years of that
Right.
because of slavery. And slavery cuts off I don't know my name. What does my name mean? It's not my name, not my last name. That it's the last name of somebody who owned my ancestors. I don't have any real cultural connection to my name. So I'll tell you, for Black people, that's why first names are so important, because that's the only name that we know our family gave us, because our last names were probably based on who owned us. So we're talking about, so that's my name right now. My name right now is probably a slave name that was given to me by a slave owner who owned my family. So how does that impact me now? I don't have a strong connection to my last name. It's only my first name that I know was actually given by my family. And then economically, like I said, it's just connections, because I know and you know, knowing people is important. And this is part of where I get into the systematic racism. Knowing people is important, to the point where now systematic racism can be implemented in a manner that the people who are doing it don't even intend to. So they went to school in 1800s, 1860s, 1870s with other white people, made connections, knew other white people. 1900s, went to school, college, high school, all the white people, knew other white people, recommended them for jobs. Same thing all the way through the 1900s, even when we couldn't vote, when we couldn't go to integrated schools up into the 1960s, 60 years ago. So all of those 100 years, they were making connections, they were knowing people. So this is how it happens. Somebody wants a job. Well, I know this guy, so I'll hire his son. His son is white because the guy is white, because his grandfather went to school together, because they were both white. So when he picks the guy, it's not racist on his part. He's picking a guy he knows. But
Sure.
why does he know him? Because they went to school together. Why did he not go to school with any black people? Because of slavery, because of Jim Crow laws, because they couldn't go to college together. So all of that even impacts today, even wealth. And I think the name of the book is called "The Law of Race," or the Color of Law. I mix it up, but he talks about FHA loans were created with racist segments, where they would say you cannot sell these homes to black people or African Americans. So they would build whole suburbs, and one of the conditions is you could only sell to white people. What happened is the developers would build all this property, like lots of land. And then and some people think this is the South. No, this is everywhere. We're talking. I think this is talking about California. They would build these huge developments, and they were like, "How are you going to get these people to leave the city and go out there?" Well, the hook was they could live in an all-white neighborhood because we won't sell it to African Americans. So then they would sell those properties to whites only. No African Americans were allowed. And even in the mortgage, it would say one of the conditions is you can't sell your home to another African American. So they were building this all white society in a way in these suburbs. And then what would happen is what happened? Those houses, they gained equity, they gained wealth that black people were excluded from. So that house that they bought in the 40s or 50s that was worth $10,000 now is worth 300, 400, $500,000. And that equity and that wealth was saved only for white people, because black people were excluded from owning properties in those regions. And that's happened all over the nation. And that was FHA, Federal Housing Authority. That was codified in law. In fact, some of those mortgages still have that condition, even though they're not enforced, that it says you cannot sell to African Americans or to black people. So that not only are we talking about socially passed down systemic racism, but we're talking about financially induced racism that kept us out of financial gains as well. They always talk about the 40 acres and a mule. That wasn't given to black people. Or homesteading, the acts that allowed white people to spread across the land, and we're trying to reach from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Those only for white people. That wasn't for black people. Couldn't make claims on those properties, and then have property, which of course has been the foundation of wealth in America. Owning property, couldn't have that. So even when we were released, we weren't released and given property.
You're given boundaries.
we were given boundaries, and then we were conditioned to go back to slavery. We're like, you're free, but you don't have anywhere to go and you don't have a home. So you can stay here, and your housing, your lodging will be your remuneration, will be your pay. So that building of wealth in the United States was robbed as it relates to slavery and institutions. And I'll say this because I said it to you, you laughed when I said it. To everyone who says, well, why don't y'all leave when we don't agree with something? Why won't y'all leave and go somewhere else? Why would we leave a country we built for free? Why would we leave it? We built it. So in a way, it's like, when a couple breaks up and they get mad at each other and they're like, oh, we're breaking up and I'm taking all my stuff
Yeah.
with me. Okay, all right, we're gonna tear down all the buildings that we built and let you rebuild, and the wealth that we built, for free, that established, we're taking that with us. So I mean, I'm real sensitive when somebody says just because we disagree, or just why don't you leave and go to another country. So,
Sure.
but like I said, all of those, like you said, are foundations that were built in slavery and that they continue. And like you said, even the stigmas of racism. The Daughters of the American Revolution, part of their initial founding purpose was to change the narrative of slavery, to tell people, and this is what they told, and then this was what they told them to teach, even in the schools, to teach that the conflict, the Civil War, was a conflict of Northern aggression.
A small disagreement.
Here, it was a conflict of Northern aggression that was not about slavery. That was their dogma. That's what they taught. They even helped approve textbooks that related to the Civil War, so that they made sure they whitewashed the institution and the ugliness of slavery and made it about the Northern aggression. And then they had the same agenda as it relates to the flag, because the Confederate flag, first of all, it wasn't even the foundational flag of the Confederacy that lasted for 5 years. It became related to the Daughters of the American Revolution and then also picked up by the Ku Klux Klan, and has a much longer history with those two organizations than it ever had with the Confederacy itself. So, but that was ingrained and taught. And and as I look back, and you talking about how does it impact, when I was educated, and I'm dating myself, but I was educated basically in the late '80s, early '90s, in K through 12. Nobody ever taught me about George Washington being a major slaveholder, that he even purchased slaves while he was president. Nobody taught me about, I'm talking about in school, Thomas Jefferson having feelings that black people were inferior, even when he wrote the words, all men are created equal, and that we're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All the while, he had slaves maintaining his property, and a slave girl in his house who he was sleeping with, who he had children with. And obviously, today we would treat that different,
Right.
because there's an inequity of power, and then he would sell her children as slaves. Never learned about that in school, K through 12. Never learned about those conflicts of those. Even Abraham Lincoln, that his primary objective wasn't even liberating the slaves or the ending of slavery. His primary objective was maintaining the union
Yeah.
and keeping the union together. So when you find that out later, to me as an African American, I felt like I got robbed. I got robbed. You told me all these people were great men, and you didn't explain to me in context what this meant. And as a free person, if we weren't slaves, I could have learned that of myself. I could have taught myself
Sure.
those things. But it was like a whitewash, and that's part of slavery, trying to whitewash that evilness of this country off of the nation, and not be taught that. And like I said, I felt robbed, not by my teachers. My teachers, they were teaching the textbook they put in front of them. So I'm not blaming my teachers, but for the system to again systematically whitewash all of those evils away, and then for the purpose of, I guess, maintaining for the African American our feelings of goodwill towards our country and our forefathers, and I guess the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and all of those things. We finally kind of felt like I got hoodwinked. Finally, kind of felt like I got robbed.
Sure. And that's got to be different. And again, for me to try to identify, it's not going to happen,
Right.
because I can read about it, I can hear about it, but it doesn't touch me and affect me like that. And of course, we covered a lot of sub things there. You talked about wealth. I think the statistics now is right around 10%. If you look at the African Americans in our country, there are some rich black people, but as far as wealth distribution, it's like 10%.
Right.
And you think, well, how can that be?
Right.
Well, that happens because you don't see a lot of land ownership
Right.
where these dynasties are being handed down, and land handed down, and
Right.
businesses even
Right.
being handed down. And so you look at wealth is sustainable.
Right.
When a rich person can squander all that in no time whatsoever.
Right.
But wealth is something that you hand down and hand down and hand down and hand down. And again, because of connections and because of liberties and real freedom,
Right.
you have access
Right.
to those things where you got a much slower. In fact, I think you said this in my office. If you have two people that are running a race, and one person gets to go a lot sooner than the other person,
Right.
then they have an advantage.
Right.
Well, there's certainly been an advantage in these issues. You talked about racism and slavery, and it's always funny how there's no way you can put a pretty picture on slavery,
Right.
but yet, and we homeschool our children, and so my wife does. I don't do anything. She's the smart one. But we do a lot of tours that are historic tours,
Right.
Vicksburg and battles and different plantations and just learning history. We love learning history. And, we've been to some that are very good, and they don't try to pretty it up. They don't try to sugarcoat it.
Right.
They say, look, this is what happened here. It was horrible. It was tragic. This is the truth. And I've been to others where they try to make it sound like slavery was almost a gift.
Right.
Like, hey, we were being very nice. And, on Christmas, we would invite them in and we would give them one gift. And I'm
Right.
thinking that doesn't make it okay. But and again, understanding there's goods and bads and everything, but it still doesn't mean that it wasn't wrong.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it was wrong. And I think that's sometimes what happens. Instead of trying to just say, you know what, that was wrong and it should have
Right.
never happened, we try to find some reason to say, well, you know what, it was justified in a sense because they were sold to us, and
Right.
some of them were the ones selling it, and so
Right.
we do that, and it's almost if it justifies it was, but it was never okay.
Right.
It was not an okay thing, no matter how nice you were.
Right.
It wasn't okay.
Right.
And we can understand that. And I like to say we can understand that. Some people still won't. But we've got to try to take this and say, all right, well, some of it makes sense and some of it doesn't make sense. And I agree with you in some cases, and I might not agree with you in others.
Right.
How do we move forward?
Right.
Because that's important. Our country is being ripped up. We are more
Right.
divided now,
Right.
I believe, than we ever have been in my entire life.
Right.
Right now, today,
Right.
we're divided politically,
Right.
and everything. We've talked about this. Everything is politicized.
Right.
What you buy in the grocery store has now become
Right.
politicized.
Right.
Everything has to support something.
Right.
So we're divided politically. We're divided racially. Everybody is just being pulled. And if you don't pick a side, then you're assuming you've picked a side. And
Right.
so with the political division, the cultural division, now because of COVID-19, whether you wear a mask or don't
Right.
wear a
Right.
mask. And so
Right.
now we are so pulled and so divided. We have got to be able to get past these things,
Right.
or we're not going to survive. We're
Right.
not going to make it.
Right.
And the goal is to make it till
Right.
Jesus comes back.
Right.
I don't want it to be like this until Jesus comes back. We talked a little bit about slavery. We talked about the Confederate flag. There's a huge push right now in our country to remove anything and everything that has some type of tie to the South, the Civil War, whether it's a monument, whether it's a bust, whether it's a painting, whether it's the name of a building. And part of me understands that, but the other part of me thinks this way. If we remove everything that's ever offended anyone, if we remove anything that brings up, yes, that was a bad time, or yes, that was a bad thing. There are some monuments that those monuments remind us of a victory, but yet there's other monuments that they remind us of defeat.
Right.
You go and you look at these 9/11 monuments. There was no victory on that day.
Right.
I mean, it was a sad, terrible day where something happened. If we remove all these monuments and tear them down and burn them down, My worry is that we'll forget
Right.
the reason behind some of these monuments. In fact, recently, and I forget the exact monument, but there was a monument that was paid for and erected by freed slaves,
Mhm.
and it was the entire statue was to represent the
Right.
fight
Mhm.
to get that,
Mhm.
and they wanted it torn down.
Right.
And I believe a lot of that was because of ignorance. But if we remove it, how much more ignorant are we going to be?
Right. Yeah. And I my and let me give some foundation to that because I've gotten some background. Again, a lot of the Confederate statues that are emblematic of the Confederate times were constructed again and funded by the Daughters of the American Revolution. A lot of them did that, and a lot of these, you'll even see the timelines around the 1920s and 30s where they raised funds and erected these monuments to, again, um, get change, alter the course, alter the thoughts or the reflections of the history, and support these as being brave men, not and kind of whitewashing the rest. They may have been slave owners, they may have been racist, but they were brave men fighting, against the war of northern aggression. A lot of that is what a lot of those statues represent, that, and that's who they're erected and funded by. My thoughts on that is that, if, again, how far do you go? Because I've heard some say there are as many atrocities that have been committed under the waving of the American flag as there were by the Confederate flag. So do you take the American flag down? Because the American flag was flying, was constructed for a country that was built on racism, that was built on not including black people as people, but counting us as property. Flag was flying in 1781, the Constitutional Convention, when they designated us again as property and not people. Um, Flag was flying during even the compromises, where they designated black people as three-fifths of a person, not for the purpose of us voting, but to apportion more delegates in the South so that they'd have more representatives, because they wanted to count their property as three-fifths of a person. Flag was flying at Dred Scott versus Sanford in the Supreme Court, where they said a black person can't even sue a white person that's committed an offense against them because they do not have standing, because they're not a real citizen. So, where do you stop? Like I said, George Washington owned slaves. Do we take down the monument, the Washington Monument? I mean, we'd have to take Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. DNA evidence suggests that he has a whole family that is mixed because of his cohorting with Sally Hemings. Do we take down Monticello, or do we take down the Jefferson Monument? I mean, how far do you go? Do you take them off the money? Washington, Jefferson, do you take them off the money? Andrew Jackson, one of the most virulent racists in the history of our country, and he was an equal opportunity because he didn't like Native Americans either. Started the Trail of Tears even against the orders of the Supreme Court, and owned slaves himself, one of the biggest slave owners in Tennessee. You take him off the $20 bill. Do you take down what's the name of his take his house down? Is it no longer? Where do you stop? So I'm conflicted about that, because you could whitewash everything and take everything down, and what have you proven? I mean, because you're not erasing the history. If they were a racist, they're still a racist, whether you have a monument for them or not. I think it is important to contextualize, and I think it's also important to make sure that the monument is not doing harm, if the monument's doing harm. And I don't know if I shared with you, I know I've shared. I walked into the Tennessee State Capitol and I saw the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest looking at me. And it's almost, to me, I felt like in my heart, I looked at that and I felt the way about that. I'm like, he's like, I oppressed your ancestors, and I'm still defiantly looking at you in the Tennessee State Capitol. And no, nobody can take me down or take down my legacy of hurting, or how I felt about black people. Felt some kind of way about him being right there in the state capitol. So I think there is a balance. So I'm opposed to him being the state capital. I think that should be removed. Should it be destroyed? No. I mean, I think it has its place in history. It should be somewhere where people can observe and give context. I think it's important to give context. And a lot of these statues, instead of removing them, give it context. Give context, because make it clear. A lot of them, as I said, were erected by Daughters of American Revolution. They were propaganda pieces. They were placed there as propaganda to whitewash history and to establish these as brave men and not talk about their connections to slavery. So let's contextualize these propaganda pieces and say, hey, this guy, he fought in the war, but he was a racist, he owned slaves. Give it context, and maybe in some places not put it in honor, put in a place of honor, but put it in a place of context, put it in some things, not, don't destroy it, put it in a museum so that people can understand and put in context what they meant, and also tell that, like I said, what I was robbed of when I was in K through 12. Explain the other side of the story. Make it clear that there are some people who are very disturbed about this image and they have a reason for feeling that way. So I think that. So, but when it's in a place of honor, now that's, I do have problems with that. So like, I'm not as offended by a statue as like Forest Hall, Nathan Bedford Forrest at MTSU campus. I think that highly offensive. If I have to go, you're going to make me go to a building on a person who established the Ku Klux Klan, who obviously hates my people. Um, I think we can rename that hall.
Sure.
Now, if you have a bust of it, I'm not saying take the bust out. You can rename that hall and put that bust, and because I think they have some even historical places where you can look at statues even on campus. Put it there if you have a statue, but give context to it.
Right.
But there is no way we can't remove all of our history. We can't take everything down and start over. That's not reasonable. It's not feasible. And I think, you know, we need to just have conversations, because this is my problem. This is my other problem with snatching something out of somebody's hand. You snatch it out of their hand, they're not going to listen to you. You snatch their statue down, they don't want to hear what you have to say. You take their flag away from them and you don't give context and they don't have understanding. You're just going to make them more upset and more frustrated, and they're not going to have a conversation with you. I think it's more important that we have conversations. And maybe if we have a conversation, I saw a very powerful post of someone who had defended, who was very upset with Colin Kaepernick, didn't understand anything about it. The George Floyd situation turned him around, and he even stopped flying his Confederate flag. His heart was touched, and he stopped doing it. Had you a few years ago snatched that away from him, you may have pushed him further onto the other side where he never would have understood, never wanted to have a conversation, never wanted to get any better understanding than what he had. So I'm thinking it's kind of akin to the cancel culture. If you just cancel them, or if you just take things away from them, and there's no conversation, you run the risk of making them, pushing them further away, and then never getting them to a place of understanding. I'd rather have a conversation with a guy, talk to him 4 or 5 years from now. He says, okay, I'm not going to fly the flag, or I understand, than to snatch it from him. And then he's still mad. He's still upset. He still doesn't understand. And then you may never reach him. So it's more important to me to make the human connection than to take down a monument or snatch away a flag.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I like the way that you worded that. If you, and again, you go back, you remove all of these things. I want to understand, and the best way you understand is you go back and you learn. And sometimes you learn in your victories, but I don't know about you.
Right.
I usually learn more in my failures
Right.
than I learn in my victories. And so when you look back, whether it's our community, whether it's our state, whether it's our country, our society, when we have failed, you can see where we need to right a wrong.
Right.
And so, but when you don't feel like you've done anything wrong,
Right.
you can't convince somebody they're wrong
Right.
if they don't think they've done something wrong. But when you know that you've done something wrong, when you know that there's been an atrocity, or when you know that there's been a misstep somewhere, you realize, hey, we need to correct that. We need to fix that.
Right.
In the Old Testament, many times God or an angel of the Lord would come and they would tell the people to erect a memorial,
Right.
so the next generation would
Right.
not forget
Right.
all that God had brought them through. And so, again, I definitely, we don't want to celebrate something that promotes hate
Right.
and violence, but we do want to look at something where we can remember. And I think that's a good way, putting things in a museum. We love going to museums. and that's where you learn. We learn things that we never knew.
Right.
I don't know how good of a student you were in high school. I would never want my grades publicized because I floated through.
Right.
But there's so much that I wish I would have paid attention to, because now
Right.
as a man, I find myself going back and trying to relearn
Right.
some things to help me have a better perspective, to be the right kind of father, the right kind of husband, the right kind
Right.
of path, all these things. When we know our history,
Right.
you've got to know where you've been and know where you're going.
Right.
And so I think that helps us. And again, I think if you force it,
Right.
you can force conformity, but that doesn't help. All that does is push people to the brink,
Right.
and doing some crazy things.
And if it's there too, then and you give context to it, you can appreciate how different people are impacted by it or how people address it.
I hope and pray that each of you are touched and inspired by our service today. If you wish to partner with us, you can do so by Giveify. Download the app on Apple Store or Google Play and search for Bright Temple. If you wish to partner with us on Cash App, just look for Bright Temple in the 2 line, and in the 4 line, tell us the purpose of your gift. If you would rather mail your gift, you can mail us at Bright Temple, Post Office Box 453, Shelbyville, Tennessee 37162. Thanks in advance for your generosity, and we pray God's blessings on you and your gift.